As I said before, I'm Avery. I'm from the University of Oxford doing my master's in classical archaeology, and I am going to be talking about Freedman mummy portraits, which is quite interesting because one of the examples I'll be using is actually at Cambridge, which I think is quite interesting. And I didn't realize, obviously, before writing this paper. So Fayum or mummy portraits are a well-defined category of portraiture, which includes around 1,000 painted funerary images that come to us from different locales all over Egypt and are dated most commonly between the early 1st and mid-3rd century CE. The majority of the scholarship on these paintings has typically focused on art historical questions. As such, much work remains to be done to socially situate these portraits or to understand their function as products of the complex and malleable landscape of imperial Egypt. This paper will focus on 2 case studies, that of the Freedman Eutyches and the grammarian Hermione. And we'll examine the portraits as an extension of Freedman art, which sought to communicate social and cultural capital after death. So beginning from the 2 portraits, I will argue that Egyptian mummy portraits provided a unique and vital means of self-representation for Egyptian freedmen and their descendants. This paper will use Ward Goodenough's theory of social personae and Chris Fowler's concept of mortuary transformation to resituate Egyptian mummy portraits within a larger tradition of mortuary idealization. And the complexity of legal status in Roman Egypt will be used as a foundation to demonstrate the need for such individuals to affirm their status, wealth, or ethnicity in a constantly changing landscape of legislation. Before discussing the mummy portraits themselves, it is pertinent to situate my analysis within a few theoretical frameworks. First, it's important to emphasize the deeply contextual nature of archaeological inquiry, as well as the inherent subjectivity of the individuals who are commemorated. As Chris Fowler explains, identities are negotiated relationally and contextually, and yet there remains the issue of how one defines identity or what aspects of identity one chooses to include in an academic analysis. Examples like ethnicity, age, sex, gender, personhood, wealth, prestige, and rank are all intrinsic to the social identity of a specific individual. Now, this term social identity was coined by the sociologist Ward Goodenough to refer to aspects of identity that depended on social relations with others, relations that came with duties and rights. In examining the social and relational nature of identity creation, Goodenough acknowledged that each person has numerous social identities or social personae, which is what he called them. The fact that these personae must express a biographical reality and must fit conventional social roles means that archaeological inquiries have often approached mortuary materials as reflecting and affirming social identities constructed in life. However, to view mortuary rites as purely affirming pre-existing identities fixed at the point of death is to ignore how social relations and by extension, the social person are negotiated and transformed repeatedly through the mortuary process. As such, the meanings assigned to such materials and phenomena are ultimately culturally determined and cannot be understood as self-evidently descriptive. Chris Fowler's thesis reinforces this point as he argues that mortuary transformations are often important in achieving an idealized form of existence after death. So these frameworks inform my analysis of the following portraits, which prove to be examples of the transformation of identity of specific individuals. This transformation occurs during the very mortuary process that provides archaeologists, with their evidence. So Egyptian or Fayum mummy portraits is the term referring to a type of mortuary portraiture common in Roman Egypt, the largest quantities of which come from the Fayum basin. The practice of Roman portraiture, for example, was an artistic tradition dating much further back than the Roman imperial period. As in the Roman Republican period, funerary portrait masks were commonly used by the nobility and by families of serving magistrates to instill to younger members of the family the virtues practiced by their ancestors. Mummy portraits from Roman Egypt are considered a stylistic evolution of this tradition. Though in function, they are integral to the actual preparation of mummies in the last phase of the ancient Egyptian cult of the dead. These portraits themselves appear in the middle of the 1st century CE and continue to be used for approximately 200 years up until the mid-3rd century CE. Portraits were painted on wooden panels or plaster heads that then covered the deceased's head and included a wide variety of artistic details. However, whatever the material or artistic details, there's some Roman death masks, the aesthetic purpose of the portrait remained consistent to serve as a visual record of the deceased as he or she had appeared in life. While these portraits have artistic value, it is also important to acknowledge that these portraits served more than a purely decorative function. Rather, the artistic register of the mummy portraits allowed for their social function to be communicated without words and in a particular situ. The social function of these portraits was intensely multifaceted. The fact that most of these portraits were likely painted while the subject was still alive suggests an active form of artistic commemoration that would have involved more than simply the painter and the subject. Thus, community participation in this apparently individualized tradition was intrinsic to this process of identity construction. Individuals chose to depict themselves in ways that reflected their economic status, ethnic background, political position, or familial connections. Each portrait's clothing, jewelry, background, decorative elements like garlands, markers of employment, cups, food, etc., or in some cases, even literary inscriptions, communicated a curated identity to those viewing it. Thus, in order for these portraits to perform the function for which they were created, a reciprocal social exchange was required between the deceased and the viewer who encountered the subject's portrait post-mortem. I turn next to the local context within which both individuals in my portraits were found. It's important to note that Egypt's complex ethnic history, and this history meant that by the Roman period, equally complicated legal structures were required to define and govern the region. This continued legislative complexity provides a social and political context in which individuals needed a variety of means, including art, to affirm their status, wealth, or ethnicity. For example, already in the Ptolemaic period, ethnicity looked incredibly slippery. Ethnic categories were neither constant nor clearly defined, but were rather based on fluctuating historical circumstances and forces. The Romans, in response to Egypt's ethnic malleability, took a different and distinctly legal approach to categorization and control. They maintained a distinction between Greeks and Egyptians, but classified Hellenes as a subcategory of Egyptians. As a result, a distinctly Roman class structure emerged. At the top were holders of Roman citizenship, followed by citizens of 3, then 4 Greek cities, and the final and lowest class in Roman Egypt included Egyptians, or peregrine non-citizens in Roman terms, which included individuals not in the previous 2 categories. So this composite, contested, relational, and mutable character of ethnicity and legal status in Roman Egypt is undoubtedly at the root of the complexity in constructing identities via art. All individuals, whether holders of Roman citizenship, non-Roman citizens, or non-citizens, would have been subject to a continually fluctuating regional landscape in which maintaining or creating an identity was vital in communicating social, political, or economic capital. Freed people then would have been doubly interested in self-asserting their identity due to their former enslaved status. Mummy portraits presented an entirely autonomous opportunity, separate from traditional administrative structures, for individuals then to control their own identity. It is no surprise that these identities were often idealized. So 2 case studies illuminate my analysis. The first one being the portrait of the Freedman Eutyches, which is now housed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. The portrait depicts a young man in 3/4 view, and the young man faces out towards the viewer, looking directly out from the portrait. Scholars have dated the portrait to the first half of the 2nd century CE, but the dating is a bit contentious because there's no known provenance for the portrait. The inscription is one of the most interesting in the corpus, which appears on the boy's chest, and it refers directly to the subject as Eutyches, freedman of Cassianus Heraclides. The portrait's artistic details then can be read through a lens of mortuary identity construction. To begin, the inscription itself situates the subject as part of a specific class of freedmen, a fact which would have immediately communicated a variety of political, economic, and social implications to a viewer. The painting appears intensely lifelike, as incredibly fine brushstrokes create a highly realistic depiction of Eutyches. This constructed realism is notable when compared to the corpus of mummy portraits as a whole, since the vast majority of individuals are depicted with much rougher brushstrokes and far less attention to detail. The shining, almost completely smooth golden hair of Eutyches, as well as other details, again serve to create this naturalistic exemplum of the subject. Eutyches' hair is a rich dark brown, painted in tiny, wispy brushstrokes. His eyes are ringed with delicate eyelashes and a subtle ring of dark kohl. The left side of his body is softly shadowed and turned away from an external source of light. While all these details at a basic artistic level serve to reflect how Eutyches most likely actually appeared in life, they also contribute to Fowler's idea of funerary identity construction. Such attention to an accurate funerary depiction can be read antithetically as a marker of mortuary idealization. A freedman such as Eutyches would have had an interest in asserting his status, whether social, economic, or political, to the community to which he belonged, especially as someone who was unable to live a long life after manumission. Other details in the portrait further support this analysis. Eutyches is dressed in a white tunic with a purple clavis draped over his right shoulder. A white mantle sits across his left shoulder, and under which is written the 3 lines of Greek text. The choice of clothing, the Augusti clavia, reinforces an idealized identity. The purple clavis, in Roman tradition, indicated a social status above regular citizenry, but below senators and magistrates. The exact function of such dress in Roman Egypt is not as important as the fact that it communicated a specific kind of Roman identity, one linked to political participation and elite status. Also, the presence of the text itself could suggest a certain level of education, another marker of eliteness or community integration. All of these features were thus chances for Eutyches, a freedman, to assert an idealized form of his own identity via an intensely malleable form of artistic commemoration. Another example of freedman mummy portrait commemoration appears in the portrait of Hermione, discovered and excavated by Flinders Petrie in 1910 and 11 at Hawara. The portrait of Hermione now resides in Girton College, Cambridge. The portrait, which is dated to the early 1st century CE, is set among intricate bandages, which are wound in layers in a rhomboid pattern. The left of Hermione's neck reads Hermione Grammaticae. Unusually, this inscription provides both the name and profession of the subject in question. Various interpretations of the Grammaticae inscription have provided many possibilities concerning the position, status, and ethnicity of the woman Hermione, all dependent on various translations of the mysterious Greek word Grammaticae. However, for this analysis, I've chosen to proceed via Dominic Montserrat's reading of the inscription as one that depicts a wealthy freedwoman whose employment was that of a grammarian or teacher. The portrait itself has a painting style much less detailed than that of Eutyches, and Hermione is depicted in a close set view with only the edges of a light-colored tunic visible. She wears large rounded earrings, and her dark hair is drawn away from her face, parted down the middle of her scalp. These details, together with the portrait's inscription, can be viewed as attempts to delineate and curate a form of identity that would be immortalized after death. Just as with the portrait of Eutyches, Hermione's artistic features communicate a lifelike reality, while providing a sense of authenticity. Walker suggests that her clothing and jewelry follow patterns of elite Roman dress and display, thus placing Hermione's depiction within a similar visual lexicon of Roman aristocracy. The most important marker of freed person's self-definition remains the inscription itself, however. Hermione most likely chose to include her profession on her funerary portrait, thus personally curating a narrative of identity. And the gender dynamic of Hermione's portrait adds another layer of meaning to this choice. Hermione's identity as a woman would have shaped her experience as a slave, a freed woman, and grammarian. In navigating these varied systems of oppression, the creation of a personal identity could have presented a vital form of self-preservation for someone who existed at the nexus of different systems of alienation. So these two case studies provide an intensely focused analysis concerning freed person identity construction. This analysis is naturally constrained by the limited quantity of mummy portraits and the lack of inscriptions that are included on those portraits. This means that while we don't have any other inscriptional evidence confirming freed person status on mummy portraits, the existence of Eutyches and Hermione suggests the possibility that many of the other individuals depicted in these portraits may also have been freedmen, just without an inscription. The variety in subjects across the spectrum reinforces the social role that these portraits performed. A vastly varied contingent of a diverse population was equally interested in using this specific form of mortuary commemoration in order to curate a distinct identity in death. So if this desire can be understood as foundational to the creation of Egyptian mummy portraits, the added dimension of freed person status would have suggested an even greater need to construct an idealized funerary identity due to the natal alienation that slaves were subject to. One other example of artistic delineations of freed person identity is found in Petronius's Satyricon, where the work's protagonist, Encolpius, steps into the home of the wealthy freedman Trimalchio and is amazed at the mural painted on the wall that depicts Trimalchio himself holding a wand of Mercury and being led into Rome by Minerva. The full quote is right there. This description of one freedman's decorative self-definition noticeably reflects many of the elements of mortuary idealization that Egyptian portraits suggest. Trimalchio, in his own home, commissioned a piece of decorative art in which he himself is the subject and in which his identity is satirically idealized. While this example is part of a larger comedic commentary, its existence reinforces an understanding of freed person art that prioritizes self-definition and identity curation. Mummy portraits, just like Trimalchio's mural, were incredibly effective at conveying an individual sense of identity through their use of a widely understood and accepted visual register. Freedmen constituted a separate collective identity that in many ways required much more conscious forms of memorialization. Thus, the localized, competitive, and malleable landscape of Roman Egypt allowed freedmen such as Hermione and Eutyches to assert their identity through a process of mortuary transformation. And thus, the corpus of Egyptian mummy portraits allows for a much more nuanced understanding of the ways in which freed people sought to communicate and construct identity in the ancient world. Thank you.